So I'd like to welcome our speaker for today, Jacob Teter from the International Energy, make sure I get it right, Agency, and also a UC Davis. We're proud of him, and hopefully he's proud of being a UC Davis alum. And this is a part of our decarbonization series that we're doing in the seminar this quarter. And this is, I would say, not very arguably the most important part. So with that, I'll welcome Jacob and also ask you to say a few words about career and a little bit of advice and path for all the students in the room.
Right, so it's a really big honor and it's really fun to be back here. I come every couple of years. We get home leave every 2 years from the IEA, and I make sure to visit Davis every time. I walked in through the Tule fog. It was also really nice to see that the Tule fog still makes an appearance.
First time in 2 years.
Now and then, yeah. And I guess the seasons in California are changing in some scary ways, but I was a student here basically over lots of the Obama era. I had a really fun graduate school career. I got to do a lot of different projects under a lot of different excellent professors. I had really close friends. I had a wonderful time. I did internships, I think, every summer. Once at the ICCT, once at the US Department of Energy, and that was a very exciting project just in the run-up to Copenhagen, where we tried to work under the Secretary of Energy and the Deputy or the Assistant Secretary of Energy to forge projects for cooperation with China. Also at the Institute for IEA, what does it stand for? For Integrated Applied Systems Analysis, so like a modeling institute in Vienna, and also at the International Energy Agency, where I met a wonderful woman who is now the mother of my first COVID baby. And so I changed the trip here to show him off to my family with this presentation today. And I wanted to present what has been a watershed report for the International Energy Agency, and is hopefully an important contribution to political policy and technology efforts at the national and global level to decarbonize the energy system at a pace that can avoid some of the most damaging aspects of climate change. This Net Zero by 2050 report that was commissioned by the UK COP26 presidency. They came to the IEA very late last year, and they commissioned us to seeking guidance on how national governments and companies could better understand the policies, technologies, and investments that would be needed to achieve a 1.5 degree compliance scenario, focusing on the energy system. And so for the COP26, which starts already the day after tomorrow, the focal point of strengthening global ambitions and action on climate by building on the foundations of 2015 of the 2015 Paris Agreement is really what this report seeks to inform. The Net Zero by 2050 scenario aims to outline a pathway that can achieve net zero CO2 emissions by 2050, while ensuring stable and affordable energy supplies, providing universal energy access. And so by 2030, we meet that sustainable development goal of universal energy access and enabling robust economic growth. And it envisions a cost-effective and economically productive pathway, resulting in clean, dynamic, and resilient energy systems dominated by renewables like solar and wind instead of fossil fuels. And it was quite a landmark, and lots of the media reporting of this scenario has really focused on the fact that for the first time, the IEA's messaging is saying, if we want to achieve this, no new investments in unabated fossil should be made, no new investments in oil fields or refineries, in new coal exploration or natural gas. The report lays out the investments that would be needed over the coming decade and thereafter to deploy technologies that are already on the market, and the policies and investments that would be needed to accelerate the scale up of lower TRL level technologies that are just at prototype or demonstration phases, to try to tee them up so that they would enter the market by 2030. And kind of the narrative of the report focuses then on these two chunks: what needs to happen in the coming decade, and then how that sets up a trajectory out to 2050. Finally, the report also examines a couple of the key uncertainties that inevitably come up in kind of long-term energy modeling, such as the roles of bioenergy, carbon capture, utilization and storage, and behavioral changes in reaching net zero. In my presentation today, I'll focus on the trajectory for transports in an energy system that can achieve net zero by 2050. This is a trajectory that I helped to establish and delineate, leading a small team in the division, the Energy Technology and Policy Division of the IEA, in collaboration with colleagues working primarily in the World Energy Outlook Division of the IEA. And the World Energy Outlook has just been released over the past couple of weeks. I haven't been following it all that closely, but everything that I'm presenting here today for this net zero scenario dates from the May net zero scenario. And we were just talking about how this is such a moving target. And so, you know, there will already be slight changes in the World Energy Outlook report in the scenario, the net zero scenario, that you would be able to get that's kind of hot off the presses. And what I'm going to present here today, I didn't take any of my time out of my vacation to update and follow in great detail the changes that have been made in that kind of new edition. It's worth highlighting up front some of the key aspects of the trajectory and of the transport transitions in climate constrained scenarios as modeled in recent years in the IEA in general. First, energy efficiency measures are front-loaded in IEA scenarios, and this is true across the entire energy sector and in transport in particular. Energy efficiency measures not only tend to be among the most cost-effective mitigation measures, but they also tend to lead to other big benefits, whether at the private level, you know, leading to lower cost of ownership. We can get the purchase premium of things like, for instance, hybrids, but also especially electric vehicles. And then societal benefits, from reducing oil import dependence and increasing energy security to reducing local or in US criteria air pollutant emissions. And the health impacts of vehicle operations. It's also worth highlighting that kind of in the IEA jargon, energy efficiency is envisioned not only to encompass vehicle level changes, but system level changes and operational measures. So, you know, in transport, lots of our messaging has focused in the past on the avoid, shift, improve kind of hierarchy, the idea that first you want to avoid discretionary trips whenever possible, perhaps through fiscal policies, which can at least encourage trip chaining. Next, you want to shift trips to lower carbon intensive modes. And finally, you want to focus on those vehicle operations that are most necessary and are going to happen as the economy develops, as people travel, as goods are delivered, to improve vehicle efficiency and to reduce the carbon intensity of fuels. The second big pillar in reducing CO2 emissions is switching to low carbon fuels. And here, as you'll see in the presentation, you know, what we see as most effective and cost effective varies at a high level by mode, but you can get even kind of deeper into the weeds and talk about how it might vary regionally or for different applications.
Sorry.
Yeah.
There are too many slides, or because this, I mean, this is the first slide, and the slides have changed on your laptop, or?
No, I'm still on this first slide, but I'm finally getting through it.
I thought that you are changing a slide on your laptop, and it is freeze there. Sorry.
Yeah. And you know, as you'll see, even in transport, as across all end use sectors, electrification is the key lever. You know, the take up of renewables and unsurprisingly solar and wind, together with the electrification of end use devices, is the prerequisite of the clean energy transition. And then in maritime and aviation, since directed electrification is likely to be viable only for very short distance applications, we look more at the role of synthetic fuels, aka electrofuels, and biofuels in particular. And then finally, the report lays out the infrastructure deployment that would be needed to achieve the net zero scenario. So as you all know, many governments and companies have announced ambitions to reach net zero emissions in the coming decades. And most often the target year is intensely. Of course, some countries aim to achieve the target earlier, some of it later, but 2050 is increasingly becoming the target year of climate ambitions. Net zero pledges to date cover around 70% of global GDP and CO2 emissions. However, fewer than a quarter of the announced net zero pledges are actually fixed in domestic legislation, and few are yet underpinned by specific measures or policies to deliver them in full and on time. So the first chapter of this, very thick report, 350 some odd page report, deals with the scenario that the IEA has used for quite a while now, called the stated policy scenario. And that takes into account only the specific policies that are in place and have been announced by governments. So things like fuel economy standards or CO2 emission standards, biofuels policy, various incentives, electric vehicle incentives, etc. This is kind of a business as usual scenario, and what's really interesting is to track how the CO2 threshold of this business scenario, as usual scenario has evolved over time, as the projections of what is likely to happen given the current policy framework have bent the curve down in terms of global energy-related CO2 emissions. And then second, in this first chapter, there's a really interesting and important tracking exercise that the IEA has started to do. And then in the net zero report in May, this was called the announced pledges case. And now it's been upgraded from a case to a scenario, the announced pledges scenario. And this scenario assumes that all the announced national net zero pledges are achieved in full and on time, regardless of whether they're underpinned by specific policies. And in this latest World Energy Outlook, and in a new slate of reports that I'll kind of highlight in the last slide of this presentation that our colleagues in our division has done, we've been trying to benchmark how different parts of the energy system are contributing to, or whether they're on track, or what they would look like in this announced pledges scenario. So here you see, and this actually is from the latest World Energy Outlook 2021. So this report that came out just a couple of weeks ago. The climate, actually the CO2, direct CO2 emissions of fossil fuel combustion in the stated policy scenario, the steps, the announced pledges scenario. So this scenario that assumes that all the net zero pledges that don't necessarily have regulation or legislation or policy behind them are realized. The conventional IEA sustainable development scenario, and this is a scenario that basically achieves 2 degrees, and also universal energy access, clean cooking, and considerable reductions in local air pollution. And then this net zero scenario, the net zero emission scenario, the NZE. And first you see that there's this big gap of 2.6 gigatons difference between the steps, the trajectory that we're on, and the announced pledges scenario. And this highlights the implementation gap that exists between these announced pledges and the policy frameworks and specific measures that they would require. And so the argument is that pledges need to be underpinned by strong, credible policies and long-term plans to make them a reality. And here again, the idea is to inform the negotiations that will start happening the day after tomorrow. However, even if you were to put in place policies to achieve these pledges, this would fill less than 20% of the total gap between the steps and the net zero scenario, so the top line and the bottom line. One really useful way to compare the IEA NetZero scenario, which in lots of our presentations we take great pains to emphasize, is a scenario among many different trajectories to getting to net zero in the energy system by 2050. Is to stack it up against comparable modeling done by other groups working in integrated assessment modeling. So the net zero scenario was designed to ensure that energy-related and industrial process CO2 emissions, which are 3/4 of total anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, are in line with the 1.5 degree threshold with little or with no or low or limited temperature overshoot. And so the IPCC in 2019 came out with a special report on global warming of 1.5 degree scenario, and there are a lot of integrated assessment modeling teams that look at energy systems and environmental systems, came out with a lot of scenarios, and here we're comparing the IEA scenario with just those other scenarios that have low or limited overshoot from that 2018 special report. And what you see here when you compare is that the IEA scenario relies on relatively little carbon capture, on less CO2 removal than any of the IPCC scenarios. Is on the low end also for bioenergy requirements. And here we've made a conscious decision, since we are the International Energy Agency and our expertise does not lie in what the UNFCCC or IPCC jargon is called agriculture, forestry, and other land use. We made a conscious decision to cap ourselves at 100 exajoules of primary energy, which is on the very low end in global assessments of what kind of the sustainable bioenergy stock might be that could be used across the energy system. And also, to better understand the local pollutant emission implications and the land use impacts and associated emissions of our scenarios, we work together with this Austria-based institute, the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis, to couple our modeling with their gains model. And you see some ITS alum have worked quite closely with the gains model, and some of them were involved in some of the modeling about the local air pollution impacts of diesel engines, for instance, and with their GloBiome model. So this is a integrated, actually it's a land use and agriculture model. So we relied on them to do lots of this local air pollutant and land use modeling, and we coupled our modeling with theirs. So the IEA scenario kind of stacks up against these other IPCC scenarios, kind of as shown in this slide. So I said that the messaging focuses first on what needs to happen this decade, and then kind of how the energy system would evolve to mid-century. And the high-level message is that the pathway to net zero is narrow but feasible, and that the next decade will be pivotal. Accelerated deployment of market available technologies, of commercial technologies is critical, but we also need to increase investment on demonstration level technologies. We need to cut energy-related and industrial process CO2 emissions by about 12 gigatons over the coming decade to keep the world on track for 1.5 degrees. So just over this coming decade, this translates to the need for massive investments in clean energy, rapid deployment of efficiency technologies, many of which require a switch to direct use of clean electricity, for instance, heat pumps in buildings, electric arc furnaces in industry, and of course, electric road vehicles, two-wheelers, cars, buses, and trucks. So one high-level metric is that we would need to quadruple capacity additions in solar and wind, reaching around 100 gigawatts, and to maintain the same growth rate as over the past decade, but from a higher starting point. This would equate to the same daily capacity additions as today's largest solar plant, which is 2.2 gigawatts in Badla, India. So this is an ambitious rate of growth, but one that's been achieved over the past decade. You would need to see a nearly 20-fold growth in electric car sales, from about a 5% sales share back when this report was done in 2020 to around a 60% sales share already in 2030. This is roughly double the ambition that we've seen if we track the ambition from OEMs, from the whole EV ecosystem, from battery suppliers to OEMs in terms of their announcements of new models or sales share. And has huge implications on the need to scale up battery production capacity and on the need for critical minerals. And I'll touch briefly upon some of those needs, just to say that in the global EV outlook, where we in 2020 got some help from ITS students and alum, we track the electric vehicle market and project out what sales could be under the different IEA scenarios. And there's been a lot of promising movement in terms of how this gap is closing between what OEMs and governments and battery producers are announcing and putting online, and what would be needed, say, for the announced pledges scenario or the sustainable development scenario. And while there's still a big gap and lots of the kind of transformations that would need to happen in the coming decade are hard to imagine, the gap is closing relatively quickly for EVs, and so that we often are talking at the IEA about kind of the hope that comes from electrification of road vehicles. Finally, efficiency improvements. I mentioned that front-loading efficiency improvements leads to a lot of benefits and is often no regrets kind of technology pathway to achieving these goals. Here you could look at it through the energy intensity of GDP across energy supply, transformation, fuel provisions, and demand sectors. The net zero emissions by 2050 scenario would require 4% annual reductions in the energy intensity of GDP, and this is about 3 times faster than we've seen in the past few decades. So here, the level of ambition needed is quite high. I think I'll skip this slide in the interest of time. Looking beyond the next decade, then to mid-century, we've estimated that about half of the cumulative emission savings over the period to 2050 come from technologies that are already on the market. And a small fraction of the emissions reductions come from behavioral changes, things like reducing discretionary travel and shifting to lower carbon intensity modes. But nearly the other half of emission reductions will need to come from technologies that are not yet commercially available, that are either under demonstration stage or in some cases just at like large prototype or even small prototype level. A selection of some of the key technologies that are key components of the net zero scenario are listed here. And our modeling takes into account more than 400 technologies across the energy sector, evaluating their current CapEx and OpEx and fuel costs and efficiencies, their level of technology readiness, their potential for cost reductions, efficiency improvements, and fuel switching. And here I'd like to highlight there are a lot of online resources that the IEA is getting better at offering to national level policymakers or researchers in an interactive way. And here we have something called the Clean Energy Technology Guide, where we evaluate these 400 technologies and provide some detail on their TRL, on who's working on them, on how they work, et cetera, et cetera. So given the mandate from the COP presidency to inform government's policies and targets at the upcoming COP, the report sets out tangible, trackable milestones, more than 400 in total. And these are some of the key high-level milestones appearing on the screen, spanning across all energy sectors and technology for what would need to happen and by when to transform the global economy to from one that's dominated by fossil fuels into one powered predominantly by renewable energy like solar and wind. And here again, there's an online tool which we developed for the report that explores all of these, allows users to explore all of these milestones. And indeed, kind of the high-level milestone on phasing out internal combustion engine and light-duty vehicles by 2035 is one that is both very ambitious, very eye-catching, but also, there's a very compelling argument that to achieve net zero by 2050, this is around the date when you would need to phase out ICEs in light-duty vehicles, and you would have to have a very fast penetration of zero-emission vehicles also in the heavy-duty sector to get there. So now, coming finally to the roadmap for transport in the net zero emissions by 2050 world. Highlighted here are some of the considerations and questions that we had to address when we were formulating this scenario. Here again, in italics, are some of the high-level milestones for policy needs and for implementation that we've been communicating for the transport sector. one of the most compelling needs and one of the most compelling cases in transport is to electrify a road. Road emissions account for nearly 3/4 of transport operational emissions on a world-to-wheel basis. Vehicle electrification is the clear technology pathway for most road vehicle operations. Of course, the question arises, what is the role for fuel cell electric vehicles? In what segments of road operations do they make sense? In long haul or regional freight? Do they make sense? Is there a role in taxi fleets, for instance? Another high key level, this is just kind of the 2035 target. In all sectors, alternatives to mostly oil-based fuels will require scaling up new mineral mining and refining and processing pathways. And here it's worth highlighting another report that was released at the same time as the NetZero report on the role of critical minerals in the energy transition. And here we look at the question, are there bottlenecks or potential red flags that would come from the need for things like copper and lithium and other even rare earth metals that go into things like electric motors and PV and solar and electric batteries. And this is something also that in the NetZero report, we assessed the scale up of mineral operations that would need to happen. So now looking at the CO2 emissions in transport by mode, one thing that's worth highlighting here again is that the IEA is communicating on direct fossil emissions, direct CO2 emissions of fossil fuel combustion. So this is not a well-to-wheels metric. When we're crafting these scenarios, we have to look at a few key drivers that lead to our activity or our demand projections behind the scenes. So one is the baseline expectation for activity demand growth, especially in developing and emerging economies, which come as incomes rise and to a lesser extent as populations grow. Another is, to what extent is there, how much potential is there for behavior to make an impact? Things like modal shift as incented by policies at the city, subnational, national, and regional level, like the EU level, to reduce both the total motorized transport activity and to shift to things like rail and buses. And then a final consideration in kind of framing how we analyze these scenarios and build these scenarios is the maturity level of the most promising technologies, both in terms of and which technologies are the most promising, both in terms of being effective and cost effective for decarbonizing transport operations. And here, in the so-called hard to abate, even harder to abate, you might say, transport sectors, road freight, maritime, and aviation, many of the technologies that would be needed to substantially reduce the carbon intensity of vehicle operations are either just entering the market, like battery electric trucks, as shown in green, or cold ironing, or rotor sails, or other wind assistance technologies like kites and shipping, or else they're just at the demonstration or prototype phases, things like ship engines, or even fuel cells that could run on ammonia or hydrogen, or things like open rotors or blended wing body aircraft, or aircraft even directly fueled by hydrogen or electricity, including hybrid designs in aviation. And then a final consideration is the fact that even when technologies are starting to enter the market, various policies would be needed to accelerate their adoption or to make them more attractive to end users. And I've got some examples of these policies, but I'd rather leave that for the discussion and maybe debate at the end. If you think about a net zero scenario, and maybe this particular net zero scenario, or maybe another one, I wanted to maybe talk through all of you and turn the tables and get your ideas on what near-term policies would be needed to kind of catalyze this kind of tremendous change. And then it's no surprise that decarbonizing transport necessitates a shift from fossil fuels to alternative low carbon fuels and powertrains that rely on motors and fuel cells and energy carriers like electricity and hydrogen, which emit no direct or tailpipe CO2 emissions. Across the transport sector at large, so all of these modes, in the early 2040s, electricity already becomes the dominant fuel in the transport sector. It accounts for nearly 45% of total final consumption in 2050. And if you take into account the fact that electric vehicles are, between 2 to 5 times more efficient than comparable internal combustion engine vehicles, then this means activity on those electric vehicles is that much higher. Here we're communicating on total final energy. Hydrogen-based fuels, hydrogen and hydrogen-based fuels, and here we mean hydrogen plus a carbon source to make electrofuels, whether that carbon source is, industrial waste streams or biogenic or atmospheric, make up 28%, and bioenergy biofuels 16%. Biofuels already reach a 15% blending share in oil products by 2030 in road transport, which reduces oil needs by around 4.5 billion barrels of oil equivalent per day. And then beyond 2030, biofuels are increasingly diverted to aviation and shipping and away from road as electrification starts to take hold across wider and wider segments of both regionally and in terms of operations. The rapid increase in electric vehicle sales in the net zero scenario would require an immediate scale up of new supply chains for batteries, as well as recharging and low emissions refueling infrastructure. The number of public charging points that we estimate would be required for EVs rises from around 1 million at the time of the report to 40 million in 2030, requiring an annual investment of almost 90 billion in 2030. Annual battery production for EVs would leap from 160 gigawatt hours today to 6,600 gigawatt hours in 2030. This is more than a 40-fold growth over a decade, and it would be the equivalent of adding almost 20 gigafactories each year for the next 10 years, taking the current gigafactory size. This figure shows the distribution of daily driving distance that we've estimated across all medium and heavy duty trucks in operations for road freight, and shows the assumption of the market shares in 2050 between battery electrics and fuel cell electric trucks. So this is just illustrating, that the vehicle range is a key component for considerations of whether fuel cell trucks or battery trucks make sense. There are a lot of other parameters and assumptions that can go into this, and if this is something that you find interesting, we can discuss and debate a bit more about what the levelized cost of hydrogen and electricity would be, about what kind of refueling time constraints there might be, about range issues, and indeed about the carbon intensity of the hydrogen being delivered to the vehicle, and what implications that has for the levelized cost of hydrogen. Then finally,
quick question.
Yeah.
Previous one.
Mhm.
It's probably without automation, so the trucks are not driving 24 hours a day.
correct. We don't explicitly have any kind of digitalization in our scenario making. This is something we've toyed with, trying to incorporate it into, and there are a lot of kind of first order effects and second order effects, and we're just not there yet. You can imagine all the different ways this would change with automation, and the ways that trucks driving at night could both get longer mileage and be operated more efficiently, and a lot of other benefits. Yeah. Maritime shipping was responsible for over 800 megatons of CO2 emissions in 2020, around 2.5% of total energy sector emissions. And here, due to the lack of available low carbon options on the market and the long lifetime of vessels, typically on the order of 30 years, shipping and aviation, shown here, are some of the few modes that do not achieve zero emissions in 2050 in this scenario. And so, it's net zero emissions for a reason. There are some positive emitting technologies like maritime and shipping, like cement, like iron and steel. And then there are some carbon capture technologies like bioenergy with CCS, like direct carbon dioxide removal, that basically sequester carbon and lead to the energy sector as a whole achieving net zero by 2050. In the short term, in aviation, there is considerable potential for curbing fuel consumption in shipping through measures to optimize operational efficiency and improve energy efficiency. And so I've mentioned wind assistance technologies, also slow steaming, just reducing the speed of ships can improve rather considerably the fuel efficiency of the ships. In the medium to long term, significant emission reductions would be achieved by switching to low carbon fuels such as biofuels, hydrogen, and ammonia. And above all, ammonia looks likely to be a particularly good candidate for scaling up because it's a fairly easy to design engines that can co-fire with ammonia, easier than directly designing engines for hydrogen. It's a good, it doesn't emit carbon, NH3, and it can be produced with low carbon hydrogen and again, some carbon source. Significant amount of R&D has to go in and both on the engine side, potentially fuel cells capable of using ammonia needs to go into making it possible to start rolling out ships capable of using ammonia by 2030. We estimate that the 20 largest ports in the world, which account for around 60% of global traffic, could become industrial hubs to produce hydrogen and ammonia. Ammonia also is already a globally traded commodity for fertilizer. It's just not being used to fuel ships. There are some safety concerns. So ammonia and to a lesser extent, hydrogen and biofuels are kind of, if you like, the destination fuels in shipping. In aviation, actually, if there's interest in aviation, I can come back to it. And we can talk about some of the fuel options and some of the potential even for direct electrification of short-haul flights, as well as activity projections in the IEA scenario. So coming back to road, then, this figure shows the sales share of battery electric, plug-in hybrid electric, and fuel cell electric vehicles, global fuel sales share of zero emission vehicles in the light duty sector, heavy duty, and in 2- and 3-wheelers. Essentially, by 2035, you would have to have effectively all light duty vehicles be ZEVs. Heavy duty trucks, you would have them only by 2050 reach 100% sales share. And even 2- and 3-wheelers, where the kind of TCO case is best, there's still quite a bit of inertia. And so by 2030, we don't think it'd be feasible to get already to 100% electric. But of all the cases, that's perhaps the strongest. Behavioral shifts in the net zero scenario. One interesting modeling innovation improvement that we were able to do for this scenario is to start to project not only at the national level kind of what vehicle ownership per capita is, but also the distribution of vehicle ownership by household level. And here, data available, reliable data is rather sparse. You have to impute data for a lot of countries. We came up with a method to impute data and to project and have policy sensitivity for the number of cars per household. And here, in the net zero scenario, behavioral changes in transport make the biggest contribution across all end use sectors. This comes from everything from, reducing BKM of cars, things like ride share, or even infrastructure investment in cities in public transit, but also non-motorized transit, to both reduce car ownership among households, but then also reduce reliance on cars. This is modeling in the net zero scenario that I helped to inform. We built out a framework for looking at the potential for avoid and shift, so reducing travel and shifting travel. On our side, I helped to inform some new modeling being done by colleagues on the Rio side. This is something also where I'd welcome kind of your inputs and critiques and critical thoughts about what you think the potential could be. Finally, to wrap up the presentation, this is just kind of a decomposition of the emissions levers and changes that would happen between 2020 and 2050. Activity, as GDP and population increase, you're going to have more demand for energy services. And then, as I've kind of tried to bang home throughout the presentation, the major lever in transport and as across all end uses, buildings and even industry, is electrification. Hydrogen and hydrogen-based fuels also start to come online mostly after 2030, and increasingly in shipping and aviation. Technology performance, so efficiency essentially, both technical efficiency in this case, and then avoided demand through things like behavioral shift and things like modal shift. And behavior in general do play a big role, in particular in aviation, where we envision that in the net zero scenario, there will be an increasing push from civil society to kind of clamp down on long distance business trips. There will be there would be needed a big push among national or subnational policymakers to build out high-speed rail on journeys where high-speed rail could compete with aviation, short-haul aviation. So we see a big role for behavioral shift in aviation, also given some of the equity concerns. And then finally, I just wanted to highlight some of the main publications that our team at the IEA has contributed to, with the exception of the Rio 2021, this report that came out only in the last couple of weeks, although I highly recommend taking a look at that. Maybe just the executive summary, and if it piques your interest, then you can delve into it a bit more. We did contribute to that, but only kind of marginally. Our division has released a roadmap to carbon neutrality in China, and here I picked the brains of some of the experts here at IPS Davis, of course, and elsewhere on how transport sector is evolving in China. Our group does this annual global EV outlook. Our division has done a new report on the role of hydrogen in the clean energy transitions. Every year we release something called Tracking Clean Energy Progress, and this looks across many different technologies and modes and thematic areas in the energy sector, and rates their progress traditionally on the metric of, are they going to achieve the sustainable development scenario? You might remember those curves. Now we benchmark things, so we're saying, are they on track to this net zero scenario? We have a traffic lighting system, green, yellow, red. Electric vehicles were one of the few green technologies. Rail was also kind of borderline green, yellow. By re-benchmarking to this much higher threshold, a lot of things went to green to yellow, or yellow to red. Finally, for COP, our group will be releasing this fuel economy in major markets. Here we purchase proprietary data covering about 90% of light duty vehicle sales and analyze that data at the model or trim level to understand the technology drivers and then also the policy and market drivers behind shifts in the rated fuel economy of the light duty vehicle fleets. We also take on a topic area every year, and our topic area this year is expanding the scope to well-to-wheel emissions. This was so that we could update the IEA mobility model so that we can communicate on well-to-wheel emissions and look at the fact that biofuels are not, according to most well-to-wheel frameworks, net zero emissions. And the next thing we have in line is to update our model. Okay, so we'll be releasing kind of a press release soon, and I'll share it with all of you, where if you want to wake up in the middle of the night, you can hear us talk about this report. Or you can listen to this. Thanks a lot for your attention.